Diabetes can have a lot of different impacts on organs in the body. Um, these complications of diabetes, we can kind of put into a number of general categories, and then you can look at how they manifest or play themselves out in different organs, which I'll sort of show you on about 2 slides from now. So one of the main complications that occurs from diabetes mellitus is, and this is a biggie here, is the production of these things called advanced glycosylated end products, or AGEs for short. And what AGEs are is when we get the attachment of all these excess glucose molecules to different proteins in the body. And this can happen in the absence of any enzyme catalyzing the event. This just spontaneously happens when glucose levels are high. They begin to attach to proteins. Proteins like, collagen fibers is a good one. And as a result, it happens on other proteins as well. As a result of this glucose attaching to proteins, it actually causes these changes to occur in the proteins that have had this sugar group bound to them. So collagen and other types of proteins, once they have once they become glycosylated or they've had glucose attached to them, they undergo some irreversible chemical rearrangements. And that's what rearrangements. And that's what induces the formation of advanced glycosylated end products. Well, why do we care about that? Well, we care about that because those advanced glycosylated end products, those AGEs, can cause the collagen that's been glycosylated to cross-link with each other. And if this occurs inside of a blood vessel, which it frequently does, that cross-linking produces a mesh-like framework in which we begin to trap lipoproteins, things like LDLs, for example. And as those LDLs and triglycerides, etc., begin to get trapped in that area, we can have a whole suite of different effects occur, many of which relate back to the cardiovascular complications of diabetes mellitus. And I'm going to talk specifically about how vasculature is affected in diabetes mellitus in another slide. So I'm going to kind of leave it at that for the moment. Now, another thing that happens is when I have proteins that are present in the plasma and they get glycosylated and we get the formation of AGEs, these AGEs then bind to AGE receptors that are found on a number of different cells, things like macrophages, and that can stimulate inflammatory-like events. They can bind to endothelial cells, such as those on the inside of blood vessels. And they can also attach to mesangial cells, which you'll remember is a type of cell that's found in a kidney nephron. So we can have effects on the kidneys as a result. And once they bind, the various types of effects we can get, which I'm going to talk about more detail later, but they can include things like the release of different types of cytokines, which we know macrophages do, for example. They increase capillary permeability. They can switch on fibroblast activity, so fibroblasts begin to secrete matrix in an area, and this can lead to clogging of arteries, for example. And you can get increased procoagulant activity, so the likelihood of developing a clot increases as well. Another commonly seen type of complication with diabetes mellitus is the activation of protein kinase C. And protein kinase C is an enzyme that's found within cells, and what happens is when sugar levels inside cells increase, as would potentially happen in, say, a type 2 diabetic, when you have hyperglycemia, this actually induces the production of protein kinase C in greater levels than we normally see. And one of the side effects of that is that protein kinase C actually induces the production of proangiogenic molecules, things like VEGF, which we talked about before, which which stands for vascular endothelial growth factor, and that contributes to the formation of new blood vessels. And we will see in places such as the eye, the increase in the total number of blood vessels present can lead to a condition called diabetic retinopathy, and it can actually even eventually result in blindness. We'll see that later. Now, a third type of complication that occurs from diabetes mellitus impacts principally, although not exclusively, but it principally impacts neuronal function. And this results because there are disturbances or perturbations of what's called the polyol pathway. And these polyol disturbances result from excess sugar. Those tissues which do not need insulin in order to take in sugar, and remember I said, for example, neuronal tissue has GLUT1 and GLUT2 proteins that allow them to take in sugar all the time, regardless of what insulin is doing. Well, they run into a problem. When a person is hyperglycemic, that means there's excess amounts of sugar in the blood, and those cells that have the ability to take up glucose, irrespective of what insulin is doing, will take on more and more and more and more sugar. And as a result, that accumulation of glucose causes a overflow of glucose into what's called the polyol pathway, which is shown over here. And in the polyol pathway, we take glucose and convert it into another type of sugar called sorbitol, and then we convert that into fructose. Again, this only happens when I have excess, or principally it happens when I have excess glucose present, that many of it spills over into this polyol pathway and is ultimately converted into sorbitol and fructose. Why do we care? Because the more sorbitol and the more fructose that's present inside of that neuron, for example, the more or the greater the osmolarity and osmolality is of the intracellular space. In other words, there's a higher concentration of particles or solutes present in the cytoplasm. And the more solutes present, the more it's going to draw water into the cell. Water begins to accumulate in the cell, and this can eventually impact cell function and lead to cell injury. So this is a critical pathway in which we get damage to neurons. Remember I said paresthesia, or the numbness and tingling kind of sensations that diabetics often experience, is a very common sign. This is probably the reason why it occurs, that there is damage to those neuronal cells because they're just getting too much sugar due to the hyperglycemia in the patient. So let's look at how these different types of complications impact different organ systems in the body. One of the big things that that diabetes causes in diabetics is many different manifestations of vascular disease. So we get things like what's called microangiopathy, or disturbances of the small vasculature in places like the brain and the feet and the hands and the eyes. We can get atherosclerosis developing. We'll see how that happens in a second. And we can get the kinds of peripheral neuropathies I talked about before, the tingling sensations, the numbness, the loss of feeling, etc. We can get diabetic neuropathy, which is all mostly based on that polyol pathway and the accumulation of sorbitol and fructose. And we also get a lot of damage to the kidneys. We get things like glomerulosclerosis, or scarring of the glomeruli. We can get pyelonephritis, which is the accumulation of pus in the kidneys due to infection. Lots of different impacts. So let's take a look at some of these in a little more detail. And I want to first highlight the kinds of problems we have with the vasculature. Diabetes mellitus can impact vasculature both on a micro scale and on a gross scale or a macro scale. So I've kind of divided these out into microvascular disease due to diabetes mellitus and macrovascular disease. So here we go. Let's start out with microvascular disease. You'll remember that these advanced glycosylated end products tend to attach themselves to endothelial cells, to mesangial cells, and also to macrophages. Well, those advanced glycosylated end products that attach themselves to the endothelial tissue of the inside of a blood vessel can actually lead to diffuse or widespread thickening of the basement membrane underneath that endothelial tissue. Imagine, if you will, I have a capillary, and that's what we're talking about with microvascular disease, principally capillaries. You remember capillaries, their job is to permit diffusion of nutrients out of the blood and the diffusion into the blood of metabolic waste products. If I have diffuse thickening of the basement membrane, that's going to impact the efficiency of movement of substances in and out of the capillaries. And ironically, and it's not understood why, but ironically, the accumulation of AGEs in capillaries in diabetics also promotes leakiness of blood vessels, of those capillaries. Again, it's not clear why that happens. We just know that it does. Any kind of perturbations of the microvasculature of the capillaries in places like the skin and the kidneys and in the eyes can lead to damage to those organs. So blindness is not uncommon among diabetics. Kidney failure as a result of these alterations of the basement membrane are not uncommon. And by the way, here, this slide here is showing you some tissue from a kidney. And it's showing the renal cortices. And what you can see here is, and here's a renal cortex, here's a renal cortex. What I want you to notice is, do you see this dark purple thickening around those renal cortices? That is a indication of thickening of the tubular basement membrane in those diabetic patients. Very clearly thickened. Here's what a normal basement membrane would look like, a very thin pink line around those cells, as opposed to the very thick lines we see here. Microvascular disease can also contribute to the development of neuropathies or problems with the nervous system, and as we said before, to problems with the retina in the eyes, or what we call retinopathies. Now, at the opposite end of the scale, let's look at the big blood vessels in a diabetic, at macrovascular disease, and see how that actually plays out. Now, you'll remember we talked previously about how lipid levels actually increase in a patient with diabetes, and so their LDL levels climb, their HDL levels plummet, and they can get high amounts of free fatty acids and triglycerides present in the blood. So we've already got a precursor situation where fat levels are higher in the blood in a diabetic, as we previously discussed. Now add on top of that the presence of these advanced glycosylated end products, which begin to deposit in the endothelial cells of, say, the aorta and other large arteries in the body. That sets up that condition I talked about before, where we get cross-linking between those glycosylated collagen and laminin fibers. And as a result of that, we set up that framework or meshwork along the wall of the blood vessel, where we start to trap all of these different triglycerides and LDL proteins, and that contributes to the formation of atherosclerosis, or plaque formation in those blood vessels. This leads a person to become much more susceptible to the development of myocardial infarction, or death of heart tissue due to ischemia, and it also makes them more susceptible to cerebral stroke. So those are the macrovascular impacts of diabetes, and in fact, the number one cause of death among diabetics is myocardial infarction. What is diabetic neuropathy? Well, this is where we get damage to the kidneys as a result. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of nephropathy. That's the next slide. In diabetic neuropathy, we're getting damage to the nerves. And as I mentioned previously, that has to do with the accumulation of sorbitol and fructose due to that polyol pathway that's converting excess glucose into those byproducts, and then we get the cellular swelling and injury that we associate with that occurring. This has particular impacts on the peripheral nervous system. This is where we usually see it manifest first, and it can manifest usually first in the lower extremities, where the person will get these paresthesias where they have numbness and tingling or loss of sensation entirely in their feet. And this can be a very dangerous situation, because if you lose sensation in your feet, then if you stub your toe or you cut your bottom of your foot or whatever, you're much less likely to know that you did so, and thus much less likely to treat the injury. So the risk of infection increases, and as I said previously, the excess amount of sugar present in blood and tissues is going to just fuel bacterial infection, and so things like gangrene become 100 times more likely in a diabetic patient than in a non-diabetic patient. We forgot to talk about diabetic nephropathy, or damage to the kidneys. So I guess I'm going to just not belabor the point too much. We'll just go back to the slide again, and I'll remind you that renal failure can occur because we get thickening of these basement membranes of the glomeruli and the renal tubules. And of course, the whole purpose of the glomeruli and the tubules is all about diffusion and filtration, and the thicker the basement membrane is, the less efficient diffusion and reabsorption can occur, and thus the kidneys begin to malfunction and no longer respond appropriately, and you can get renal failure, which is very common among advanced diabetics. Okay, the last thing to talk about was, I mentioned previously already, that diabetics are at greater risk of infection, particularly bacterial infection, when compared to the general population. And again, this principally has to do with the high glucose content of the blood and also tissues. It also has to do with the fact that the vasculature is becoming compromised in a patient due to those advanced glycosylated end products and thickening of the basement membranes. And so if my vasculature is compromised, that means less, for example, oxygen is getting delivered to tissues, and the more hypoxic a tissue becomes, the more susceptible it is to the development of gangrene. Gangrene is caused, you'll remember from Micro 205, from Bio 205, microbiology, is caused by Clostridium bacterium. And Clostridium bacteria are basically anaerobic organisms. They flourish in environments that are devoid of oxygen. So if I have compromised vasculature and I'm not delivering oxygen to tissues, wow, and I have lots of sugar, that is like the perfect environment for gangrenous bacteria to begin colonizing damaged tissue. Also, it turns out that the more glucose that's present inside red blood cells, the more it tends to attach itself. We get glycosylated end products, in other words, on proteins that are found on the surface of those red blood cells. And this turns out to directly impact the efficiency with which red blood cells unload oxygen. And so the less oxygen that red blood cells are able to take on, the less oxygen they have to deliver to tissues, and thus again the more likely we're going to have hypoxic regions where they become more susceptible to gangrene infection.